All right, everybody, welcome to our second episode of After the Breach podcast. We're your hosts, Jeff Friedman, Sarah Shimazu, and we're excited to welcome our first guest to the show, founder and director of the Orca Behavior Institute, Monika Wieland Shields. We're going to start with chatting about the different ecotypes of killer whales we see most frequently here in the Salish Sea, and then move on to talking to Monika about her research. We hope you enjoy it and can't wait to bring you even more whale-filled episodes from here on out. You guys ready to get started?
Ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Well, after our first episode, I was kind of thinking about, we didn't really introduce the two different types of killer whales that we see most frequently here in and around the San Juan Islands and in the BC waters too. And I thought Monika would be the first perfect person to talk about those with. So, Monika, you want to kind of give a basic overview of the two types of killer whales we see here in the Salish Sea?
Sure. So people are probably most familiar with the fish-eating southern resident killer whales that for many decades were the whales that were most commonly seen here. And those are the whales that are listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act and are made up of J-pod, K-pod, and L-pod. So when we refer to whales like J16 and J26 or K21, those are all southern resident killer whales. Then the second type of orca that we get in the area are the Bigg's killer whales, which were formerly commonly known as transient killer whales. And these are the marine mammal eaters. So they're here to forage on the harbor seals, stellar sea lions, harbor and Dall's porpoise. And while they used to be more infrequently encountered, they've really, their abundance here has dramatically increased in recent years. And so we've really had this sort of ongoing saga of these two populations unfolding here where we have a struggling southern resident population and then this thriving, growing Bigg's killer whale population.
Yeah, and I know that you and I were kind of out on San Juan Island, in the 90s and early 2000s when we were first kind of getting our intro to these whales, and I at least recall seeing the southern residents on an almost daily basis in the summer when I was out here, and never seeing the Bigg's killer whales or transient killer whales as we knew them at the time, and that's flipped so much, and I think we've noticed that too with our trips out. Jeff, you've probably came in kind of later in that, like you were seeing more transients and Bigg's killer whales than
when we talked about this on episode 1 a little bit. I'd love to hear more of your perspective, Monika, because I came out here and caught the very, very end of the reign of the southern resident killer whales in these waters. And I think I've seen 3 superpods where JKs and Ls get together and I've seen that 3 of them in 8 seasons, and both of you were here during the day where you'd see 3 by the end of May every year. And on the other hand, for me, the southern residents, when they do come in on those occasions, I don't know those whales nearly like you do. But having been here for the dramatic increase of Bigg's killer whales, those are the whales that I know. Those are the whales that I connect with, because that's who I see. That's who I've learned about.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to see that shift from people that have come onto the scene a little bit sooner. Because like Sarah, I started coming out here, 20 years ago, and the southern residents were the only whales that I knew. And we would, come here on a family vacation for 2 weeks in June. And we would see 3 superpods over the course of that time period. And the transients were these mystery whales. Like, do people really see them here was kind of what I thought. And it was, I was here for 4 summers before I ever saw them for the first time. And now, like you said, it's flipped completely where we're encountering them about 4 times as often as southern residents in our field work. And it's so interesting to have these newer captains and naturalists on scene that know, than as we know them now, the Bigg's killer whales so much better, and don't recognize who the southern residents are when they come in. Because for me, that's, those are the whales that I learned photo ID on.
I find the structure, the dynamic, complex structure, social structure of the Bigg's fascinating. And we'll get into that a bit, but there's been such a dramatic shift between the southern residents and the Bigg's killer whales in these waters out here. And it's happened in such a short time. What's the big factor? What's driven that change?
Yeah, we're really lucky in a lot of senses to have these two populations that live in the same geographic area, because we can really compare and contrast the two populations. A lot of things are similar because they're inhabiting the same geographic regions, so they're exposed to the same toxins, they're exposed to the same vessel effects. But the big difference is the prey availability, that we know Chinook salmon runs coastwide are struggling, and that's why the southern residents are struggling. And we've had this dramatic increase since the Marine Mammal Protection Act went into place, and this recovery of other marine mammal species that the Biggs rely on. So the seals, sea lions, and porpoises are at or above historic levels. And so that explains why their population is able to grow and thrive right now.
Yeah, it's just been super interesting to see that kind of shift over, the past couple of decades, really. And as you guys were saying, like having these kind of new generation of captains and naturalists come on, and even people who are just excited about the whales and trying to learn as much as they can and how to ID them, like the differences in the physical features. Like I know for you and I, when we first started, Monika, and like learning how to identify whales, like the southern residents each seemed so unique to me. Like their fin shape was so unique. They have the open saddle patches sometimes, or those large fingers on their saddle patches. Whereas like to me, back then, looking at the Bigg's killer whales, they looked very similar to each other. And now it's like, those are the whales that we're looking at the differences at the shape of the fin, the closed saddle patches, since they don't really have open saddle patches.
Yeah,
or they don't at all.
If you go through some of these historic sighting records, and by historic, I mean 15 years ago, people would know that they were seeing transients, but they would say, 8 transients. And, unless you had one of the iconic males, T14 or T40 or T63, they would be noted, but nobody knew who they were looking at. And, it goes to show that it's really changed. And it's amazing to me now, we have people that, the T46s are my favorite whales because I've spent so much time with them. Yet the same people, they're like, I've never seen K-pod.
Right.
And it's just mind blowing.
Well, I think like just seeing these two different contrasting populations of killer whales has kind of lent itself to a lot of potential for research and understanding of them. And you started Orca Behavior Institute. So tell us a little bit about OB.
Yeah, really, these dramatic changes in sightings were some of the initial motivation for starting the Orca Behavior Institute, because here we were, people that live in this area that are out there watching these whales all the time, and we're seeing these dramatic shifts in how often the whales are here, the types of behaviors that we are seeing, with fewer superpods or much larger groups of big killer whales coming together. And especially with the sort of unfolding conservation story happening for the southern residents, we just felt it was so important to start putting some numbers and data to these trends that we were all seeing, that this stuff can really only have a chance to influence policy and recovery actions if it gets out there in the scientific literature. So our first couple of publications were on the declining presence of the southern residents and the increasing presence of the Bigg's killer whales, just to document some of these changes in the scientific literature.
Can you talk a little bit, because I've seen some of the graphs that you've put out. Every year, I always feel like there's no way that this year can be a bigger year for the Bigg's killer whales, because they were here so much last year, and there's no way. and then that year, it's like, this is a record year for Bigg's, and then next year, I'm like, there's no way it can be better than last year, and they're here even more, and there are more and more calves being born in that population. And the trends that they're setting are just incredible.
It is. So 2017 kind of blew the previous records out of the water. We had a steadily rising increase in the presence of Bigg's killer whales, but 2017 was what I sort of thought was going to be, okay, this is a record year. But to put it in perspective, in terms of number of sightings, so number of different groups on different days that we had reported in the area, 2021 doubled 2017.
Wow.
That's how fast it's increasing.
Wow. That is absolutely incredible. And their numbers are increasing. I mean, we talked a little bit on the last episode about how we're seeing Bigg's killer whales that we don't normally see in this area, or haven't been here in a long time, or they come in very rarely, but now they're here for 3 weeks.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too. I know that Monika, you and I talk, a lot off the air, how some of these whales that we're so familiar with now, were kind of rare historically too. So like they're not only, using these waterways, but we're seeing them a lot compared to them being seen historically by researchers that have been in the field for decades.
Yeah, some of these family groups have been well known here all along, right? The T18s, the T65s, these are whales that were common here in the 80s and 90s. But these other groups that are coming in more recently, it just begs the question, how is the word spreading, right? Are they just stumbling into this area and finding out that this is a place they can feast? Or are some of these other whales that they're encountering elsewhere sort of spreading the word and saying, hey, you guys need to check out the Salish Sea?
This is the place to be seen. If you're a Bigg's killer whale, you got to go to the Salish Sea because you want to be seen there. That's where all the cool Bigg's killer whales hang out.
The Inn restaurant.
It's the Inn restaurant.
Well, for sure. And we're glad to have them, really.
We've been seeing them this spring. I mean, it's almost every day that we've been seeing them the last 3 to 4 weeks plus on our tours. And if you guys, anybody out there wants to come out and have a chance to see some Bigg's killer whales, you can come out with Sarah and I with Maya's Legacy Whale Watching.
April and May, they've always been kind of the time that the Biggs were seen here the most. But what's been really incredible the last couple of years is that trend's continuing through June and July, when these whales used to, we think, go mostly up to Alaska. And then they kind of come back here in August, September for sort of the seal pupping season. But really, there is no peak season anymore. They're just here almost all the time.
We're seeing them all, on our winter tours as well. So we see them every month of the year. And then, no longer true with southern residents.
Yeah, their presence is definitely shifted. The months that they're here most frequently have definitely shifted.
So, Monika, tell us a little bit more about Orca Behavior Institute, some of the current research that you're working on, and how people can get in touch with you and read about your organization a little bit.
Yeah, you can find us on social media. We have Facebook and Instagram, as well as some YouTube videos. We post some whale acoustics on SoundCloud. At orcabehaviorinstitute.org, you can find our publications. So after we did the sort of sightings and presence changes for both ecotypes, we've been doing an ongoing behavioral study, which is a lot of what we do when we're out in the field. And then acoustics was kind of my first introduction to whale research. And so I've been returning to those roots a little bit. Our last publication was on stereotyped whistles in southern residents. And we're starting to look at Bigg's killer whale acoustics as well, since they're here so often.
Awesome. Yeah, no, it was very interesting to hear a little bit about the stereotyped whistles and what you were finding over years on that. So definitely we'll link Orca Behavior Institute. We'll put all their links in the show notes. And definitely if you have time to read that paper, it's very interesting. So, but you have a new study going on. We kind of talked about southern residents, Bigg's killer whales eating different things. For us, it's pretty obvious that southern residents are relying on Chinook salmon, and that dwindling food source is causing a serious decline in their numbers. But there are some other, potential factors that people have been focused on for good or ill. But you're doing a vessel study. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was kind of a different track for us. But one thing that is a benefit to being a small organization like we are is that we can pivot really quickly to address kind of unique questions that come up that might take several years to go through, government vetting and government funding or whatever it is, that we can sort of say, hey, we're interested in this. Let's go out there and study it. And that was the case in 2021, looking at vessel behavior around the orcas. So in 2021, as you guys are well aware, there was a new commercial whale watch licensing program in Washington state that went into effect that was limiting the days and hours that only commercial whale watching vessels could get within, half mile of the whales. So you guys had to be half mile away for most of the year now. And one of the questions that came up during the licensing process was this potential Sentinel Effect. So we see you guys on the water, hailing other vessels on the radio or waving whale flags and, potentially mitigating incidents from occurring where especially private vessels might be, going too fast or getting too close, and you guys can kind of mitigate those impacts. And then, the flip side of that, people were asking about the magnet effect, where are whale watchers mitigating vessel impacts by preventing these high risk incidents from occurring, or are they attracting more boats to the area and potentially increasing the cumulative vessel impacts around the whales? And so there really wasn't any data out there on this topic, despite it being so heavily debated during the licensing process. So we really decided to do a pilot study for one season to look specifically at the Sentinel Effect and the potential impact of whale watching vessels on the behavior of other vessels around the whales.
And are you able to share preliminary results with that, or is there, can you share anything about that?
Yeah, for sure. So just shared some of these results with the Salish Sea Ecosystem Conference, and we'll be posting a short YouTube video that will summarize some of this as well. But we have a paper that's been submitted and is currently under peer review. And really, the take-home message is that when commercial whale watching vessels are present, the number of incidents by private vessels is basically cut in half. And so what that means is when accounting for even education and enforcement vessels, being on scene, the presence of commercial whale watching vessels is reducing how often private vessels get too close or go too fast near killer whales.
So having well-trained commercial whale watching boats out there with whales is a net positive potentially for the whales.
It's definitely decreasing the number of what we kind of call high risk incidents, where, we think the biggest or potentially most severe impact from small vessels to the whales is when there's getting too close or they're going way too fast. So their acoustic impact is greater. And yes, I think it's safe to say that the presence of commercial whale watching vessels is reducing the number of those incidents.
And it's great to have somebody doing some research and putting some data behind this, because, and Sarah can probably speak to this as well, but when I'm out there with whales and we're running a trip, it is almost daily and usually multiple times each trip where we're flagging down recreational vessels, we're calling the ferries, we're calling the big commercial shipping traffic and letting them know, hey, there are whales in the area. Slow down and be aware of what's going on around you. And we see what you have in the data. We see that we live this every day.
Yeah, and it's something that we've seen as well. And, some people have criticized us and say, well, you went in with a preconceived notion. And, well, we did, but it's based on 20 years of observation of, seeing what goes on out here on a daily basis, where we see what happens when whale watching vessels are there and when they're not. And that was the motivation for us to, put some numbers behind this. And we didn't have any guarantee that the statistics and the modeling would come out the way we thought they did. But the proof is in the data that it's this trend that we all felt we were observing is true.
And are you going to continue the same research this season as well?
We are. So really, we were doing a comparison of when commercial whale watching vessels, can be closer to southern residents and when they can't. And then we were also monitoring around both populations of whales, so the southern residents and the Biggs. And there are some other interesting trends in the data that maybe weren't statistically significant given our sample size of just one season, but we definitely think there's other factors that can be parsed out with a larger data set that may show certain areas where whale watching vessels have the greatest impact or areas where they have less of an impact. Also things like time of day, like we were monitoring sentinel actions that we could see. So obviously not the radio hails, but when you guys were waving flags, and a large proportion of the sentinel actions we observed occurred after 5 p.m. in the evening, which is when, enforcement and the education boats wouldn't be out there. So things like that, I think could be really interesting to delve into further to sort of show when and where this effect is happening the most.
Is there, I'm guessing there's more, you're getting more data. And maybe I'm wrong, but I would think you're getting more data when commercial whale watch boats are viewing Bigg's killer whales. Number one, because they're present more, but also because we're able to view them at a much closer distance than we are for southern residents most of the time.
Yeah, it was, there were definitely more encounters with Bigg's killer whales, but with southern residents, we were often able to track them for longer periods of time. So really, we had a pretty decent sample size off both populations, and we didn't see at least in our current data set from one season, there wasn't really a significant difference between the two ecotypes. So the effect that we observed occurred with both populations.
That's really interesting.
And I think just to, we talk about what the regulations are now, but not everybody knows. So just to put it out there for Washington waters here, with the new licensing program, commercial whale watching vessels can watch Bigg's killer whales at 200 yards throughout the year, any time of day.
Anytime, anywhere.
Anytime, anywhere. Southern resident killer whales for commercial vessels only. We are not allowed to approach within a half a mile, basically all year round. And then in July, August, and September, from 10 a.m. to noon, and from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m.
Visiting hours.
Our visiting hours. We're allowed to approach up to 300 yards, with the exception of groups that have a calf under a year of age or a whale that has been designated as vulnerable.
So the real clincher to those rules is that the rule for any private recreational vessel is 300 yards from southern residents year round.
24 hours a day.
Right? So you have different rules for private vessels, many of whom don't know how to identify killer whales or how to gauge distance over the water. And then you have professional whale watch operators that are given more restrictive rules. And I just want to be clear, we're not saying that there shouldn't be any rules about distances or speeds
Absolutely.
around the whales. But what was really kind of the disconnect for us here was limiting just the operators who are the most experienced for operating around the whales and that are modeling the correct behavior in terms of how far away to be and how fast to go. And when you're removing only those operators, that's the effect that we're really concerned about, is when you don't have, some professional whale watchers on scene modeling correct behavior. Sometimes you'll have private vessels that don't even know there are whales in the area. And,
Right.
In September of last year, repeatedly, we saw private boats driving right over the whales. And I don't think it was intentional. I think they just had no clue that there were whales in the area.
That's absolutely. When we're out on the water and we see mostly recreational boats speeding up in the path of whales, or they're going to go right over them, they don't know they're there. They're not doing anything, quote unquote, wrong. They're not intentionally doing this. They're just, they're not out there to see whales, and they're not looking for whales. They're going from one place to the other, and they're going at speed, and they're not paying attention to everything that's going on around them. And so then when they see somebody waving a flag, then they realize, wait, what's going on here?
Right. And I would say, with that Sentinel Effect, we've been waving the whale flag for over a year now, before the licensing rules went into effect. And I would say that definitely it's made it much harder to slow recreational vessels down when you're sitting at a half a mile than when you're at 300 yards or 200 yards, depending on the ecotype. But, boats just don't know where you're looking, right? When you're sitting off a half a mile watching whales. And I can wave that flag until my arms fall off. And sometimes I feel like I am, but they just don't see it or don't know when you're half a mile away.
And one thing that we were witnessing that also was a motivation for this study was we see what happens when there aren't boats on scene. So the vessels that have been monitoring, private boat incidents around the whales have been primarily Soundwatch and Straightwatch, but they're monitoring what's happening when Soundwatch and Straightwatch are on scene. And in addition to monitoring the scene, they're intercepting boaters as well. They're providing on-the-water education. And that's really important work. But the fact of the matter is they aren't there all the time. They're not out year round. And especially when there's multiple groups of whales in the area, they just can't be everywhere at once. And so we were seeing, what happens when it's just private vessels and just commercial whale watchers, and when there's nobody but private vessels on the water, and the kind of behaviors that happen. And I think because we were out there at all times of day, we observed both from the water, from our own vessel, we observed from commercial whale watch vessels, and we observed from shore. I think the study captures sort of a different perspective, and in some ways maybe a more complete perspective than some of the work that's come before. That is, hugely important, but inherently biased because it's happening from the platforms that are affecting private vessel behavior.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I know that they have published some reports and studies before, Soundwatch being one. I think Straightwatch has as well, maybe. But so can you speak to like the difference? I mean, you already kind of spoke to it a little bit, but is there anything else you would mention on the difference between your study and theirs besides kind of this bias that we see?
Yeah, it sounds like your study has a lot of unique factors to it that the others don't.
That was the goal, was to, try and capture some of these things that they weren't covering in the data up to this point. And because there are so many additional factors to look at, that's why, there's the caveat that this was just one season of data. But I think that's why it's worth continuing to try and look at some of these trends a little bit closer. And this isn't to take away at all, from the data that they've collected, because they have an incredibly long data set that's been monitoring vessel traffic around the whales. That's a really important piece of the picture, but it's like I said, it just inherently misses part of the picture because of the platform that they use to collect data. And so we're hoping we can sort of fill that data gap a little bit more.
Yeah, and I think more people collecting data and a variety of data, it really just helps kind of like broaden our perspective and understanding, right? So it's not like there's a negative to having another person that's experienced and knows the whales collecting data like this, regardless of the type of study or what you're doing.
And this is good data to collect as well, because I think the whale watching community out here in recent years has embraced more having the responsibility of taking those sentinel actions. I think that's something that has really been widely embraced industry-wide. And so it's a good time to start collecting some of this data. We saw you last night out on one of your field encounters. We were with the T-137s, and just for people out there, just what do you do when you're out there on your boat? Like, what does an encounter look like? I've seen you on our boats when you've come out with us and you've got a clipboard, and I've never really looked at what you're doing, and just curious what an encounter looks like. Walk us through that.
Yeah, so the main goal of our field research from the beginning has been behavioral data collection, and we've modeled that data collection off of studies that were done in the 1970s and 80s to sort of allow for direct comparison over time for potential behavioral budget shifts. So in the field, we're monitoring things like of course, where we are, who we're with, which whales are present, but also the spacing of the whales relative to one another, the speeds at which they're traveling, whether they're directional or non-directional in their movements, their orientations relative to one another, and then any surface behaviors, that could be, breaches or spy hops or, prey pursuit, especially for the big killer whales. And then we can sort of take those direct observations from the field and later on code those into sort of behavioral categories. So for example, if the whales are all tightly together, flanking one another, moving in a consistent direction at a slow speed, we can go back later and call that resting and put all of those instances into a resting category. And so we're monitoring all these factors and noting when they change to over time build up this data set to collect, look at behavioral budget and those kinds of changes. And then, on top of that, opportunistically, we also drop our hydrophone to get acoustic recordings. And then the vessel data collection has added another layer to that. But primarily, our field work has been motivated by monitoring the social associations and the behavior of the whales that we're observing.
That's really cool. Well, you got a lot last night. And we had prey pursuit, breaching, scaring cormorants.
Big spy hop from Jack.
She wasn't there at that point, but yeah, way to rub it in. Got to see Jeff's photo of the spy hop.
I'll post that in the show notes.
It's amazing because with the southern residents, I find that they tend to change their behavior a lot more often. Like collecting data on the southern residents, we can go through multiple pages in a single encounter. And with the bigs, sometimes it's like a single line of data for the entire encounter. Like they don't change what they're doing, right? They're in a certain mode and that's it. Last night was definitely different. They were engaged in quite a few different behaviors. You never know what you're going to get with the bigs.
Yeah.
That's one of the things I love about them. You never know. And when they shift behavior, sometimes they shift behavior on a dime. And especially if they're going from like searching for food or slow travel, and then they start hunting, and it bam, it's National Geographic time.
Well, I mean, that was last night too. So before you got on scene last night, the T-137s were pretty spread out. Like we had them, they had made a hunt kind of as we were getting on scene earlier, and then the four of them really spread out, and it was T-137A Jack and his sister Tempest, and then mom with the young one, right, was at least a half a mile, if not more, spread out. And they were just kind of long down times, erratic, lots of direction changes. And then you got on scene and they started hunting again. So you did come in at the best time, but it's cool to see those shifts in behavior. And now I have so much time with them that we kind of can recognize what's going on.
Yeah, and they're, the more we observe them and the longer we, get to see these whales and get to know them better, we start picking up on some of these cues when all of a sudden the hunt might happen or some strong behavioral shift. Like we've definitely seen when they all go down for a dive and you don't see them for longer, and then in the past, it's like, okay, everybody look every direction because you have no idea what's about to happen. But it's very likely, it seems like that precedes a hunt a lot of times. Like everyone kind of disappears and then the surface just erupts in action.
Mm-hmm.
So we're kind of moving into some recent sightings here. And I think we wanted to talk a little bit about recent sighting with T34A1
the saga.
And the saga.
This is an unusual one. There's never a dull moment with killer whales. There's always something new going on.
And this goes back to
last August.
And then kind of rehashed the saga this past weekend when we were out with a group of killer whales, of Bigg's killer whales.
Yeah. So T34A1, born in 2019, actually first seen in Monterey Bay. I was just looking at my notes about her, and I'm just going to kind of catch us up to like almost a year ago. I was out August 25th with Dave, one of our captains, who coincidentally is going to be a guest on one of our next episodes, hopefully the next one. And we saw her, young whale with the family. She was chasing auklets at that time and like breaching with this poor bird in her mouth, and then gave up. The bird lived. An eagle came in, tried to grab it. Anyway, long story, but so very active, energetic with her family. August 22nd. Went out on August 26th again and found the family. So T37, T37Bs, T34, and her kids. No T34A1. So 4 days later, this little kid was gone, and I think I messaged you, Monika. I was like, I'm a little concerned. T34A1 is missing.
2 years old at that point, right?
Yeah, at that point, you're assuming the worst at that point.
Right. 2 years old. And I think I reached out to Gary Sutton within a couple of days, maybe that day, and just said, hey, like we encountered this group of whales, and T34A1, we didn't see her, not present. We had a pretty good amount of time with the family. And he was the one that got back and said, yeah, no, we just actually saw her with the T36Bs and T36 in Johnstone Strait.
Which was
within a week or two, a week and a half maybe, of when we'd last seen her with the family.
Right. And that's a spread of a few hundred miles.
Yeah.
From her family.
A couple hundred miles, yeah. So, and that kind of brings us up to this spring. And Monika, you
picture your 2-year-old is off with some other family 200 miles
potentially not related. Like, not related that we know of. Right.
And so she's been with that family through the winter, as far as we know, right? And we've seen T34A1 with the 36 and 36Bs a few times this year already.
Yeah. Saw her in September. So I saw them again in September. The 36Bs, 34A1 was there. And then I think they were seen somewhere else by someone else last fall. And then, yes, now in the spring they showed up and she was still with them.
So, Jeff, you're making it sound like there was a calf napping that happened here. Like, imagine your calf is off with somebody else. I just want to say, what if it was the other way around? Imagine somebody foists their 2-year-old onto you and says, here, you deal with her.
It could go that direction too, or it could be the 2-year-old saying, hey, you know what? I like this family more.
I'm ready for an adventure.
I want some siblings, maybe.
Oh, yeah.
And the plot thickened a little bit this weekend when we saw the 36s. And when I got there, it was just the 36. It was 36 and the 36Bs, but there was no 34A1 with them.
And another captain chimed in, right, saying we have this little whale that they were 4 miles away from that group, and we have this young whale, probably a couple years old, that they had a really hard time tracking. It sounds like it was, surfacing in different directions, going fast, going slow. They tried to get a photo and couldn't even get a photo of it. But the thought, once we heard the ID of 36 and 36Bs without T34A1 there, was like, is this T34A1 and why is she now 4 miles apart from the group she's been traveling with?
And there was another additional whale
in between
the two groups, right? So
that was 37A1,
who is another 15-year-old female that has kind of like dispersed from her mom.
At a pretty young age.
Yep. And it got weirder, not weirder, but Jeff and I got out that evening, confirmed that it was, 36B with her 3 kids, and T36 was also there, but no 34A1.
And no 37A1, who, when I was out there earlier in the day, 37A1 had caught up to 36 and the 36Bs, and then for about 5 minutes, and then drifted back again. Right.
And we got a report from another captain that was on his way back to Victoria that he found 2 whales together. And he, they thought maybe it was one of the 36B kids, but then it was 2 whales and they were heading west, whereas the rest of the 36s were heading east.
So off into the sunset are 37A1 and 34A1.
Who, to make the story a little bit more interesting, are distant relatives of one another. Sarah mentioned earlier that T37 and the 37Bs travel with the 34s, and they're thought to be related. So that makes T34A1 and T37A1 first cousins once removed. So they are in the same general family tree, but not direct relatives.
And 2 young kids off roaming together. And this goes back to what I said earlier, and very different from the southern residents. The Bigg's killer whale social structure and social dynamics and the changes that happen are absolutely fascinating.
It is, because, with the southern residents, at least, and a lot of my understanding of killer whales when I was first learning about them came from what we knew about southern resident killer whales, is of course they never leave their moms. Of course they stay in these multi-generational families. And we do see a few Bigg's families that, are multiple generations. But for the most part, they are dispersing at some point. Females disperse when they start having their own kids. And we have the 36As that travel separately from 36 and the 36Bs and that kind of thing. So it's fascinating to kind of broaden my understanding of killer whales as we're learning more about the Biggs.
And the ability to track this kind of stuff has just gotten so much better as they spend more time here and people become more familiar with them. We've never seen something like this before, but it doesn't mean something like this hasn't happened before. Right. You go back 15 years to one of those sightings I was talking about, and what you guys witnessed the other day, people would say, oh, I saw 7 transient killer whales. All right. And that's it. But now we know these family relationships, we know these individuals better, and we're able to observe these really complex stories unfold. And that to me is just so fascinating.
It's one of the things I love about what we do, and the being able to take advantage of the shift out here of seeing Bigg's killer whales more. I don't think they've ever been seen this much and ID'd this much, where we can actually start documenting and keeping longer term records of these social associations and behavior patterns and where they're going and who they're going with. It's really cool.
Yeah. So super cool.
And the ability to track that is enhanced so much by you guys and the reports that you share, because, researchers, we try and get out there as much as we can, but you guys, as an industry, are out there over a much greater area so much more often, and you share these reports, and it allows us to piece these stories together over time in a way that's so much more detailed than if we were just doing it, just ourselves with what we saw.
Yeah, I think over time we're going to be able to start tracking what's going on with them from California all the way up to Alaska and through the entire whale watch community off the West Coast. And no single entity could ever get this kind of data over that period of time. It's really incredible.
I'm looking forward to getting more sightings off the Oregon coast. I think there's something going on off there.
Yeah, we
don't have a lot of eyes there.
Right? Let's
go.
There's a lot of sightings in California, right? And there's sort of that gap between here and there where not as much is reported. We know they're there.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, kind of getting into the fun stuff. We talked about the research, talked about OB. Let's talk about you a little bit. And I know, favorite topic, but we'll keep it whale focused. So, how'd you get hooked on whales, Monika?
It was love at first sight. I had a fascination with all animals, but especially whales and dolphins from a super young age. But really seeing killer whales in the wild for the first time was the point of no return for me. I was 12 years old. It was in Alaska, and it's been sort of the central focus of my life ever since that trip. Was I came home from that trip and said, hey, Mom and Dad, is there anywhere closer to home, growing up in Oregon, that we can see orcas? And that's when we learned about the San Juan Islands and the southern residents, and the rest is history from there. But there's something about them that, nobody can really describe the magnetism and the charisma that they have that sets them apart from, so many other animals that we observe. But there is that uniqueness to orcas that they're simultaneously, so similar and so different from us. That just keeps us coming back for more. I'm sure you guys can relate.
Absolutely.
Yep.
So everybody that comes on the podcast has to answer this question, including Sarah and I. We talked about this last week, but one of your all-time favorite encounters.
It's
I know
so
I know it's hard.
That's putting me on the spot here.
We talked about this last week, how you have a list in your head and your favorite always changes depending on how you're feeling and what you've been thinking about lately. So you don't have to pick out the one, right?
Well, it's like when people ask me what my favorite whale is, right? It's influenced by who I saw last week. Like, the T-137s are my favorite transients, but I just saw them last night.
J41 feels very betrayed.
That's why I specified favorite transients, you'll notice. But probably my most memorable encounter comes back to J41, because it was the time that I first saw her when she was just a couple of days old in 2005. And, we knew that she had been born, within the last day or two. She was, got the report. I was at this time, doing research out at Limekiln on the west side of San Juan Island. And we had heard about her, the day before, over in Rosario Strait with her mom, J19. And, just back then you could almost set your watch by the southern residents, right? They had a circuit that they would do, and you knew it was going to be about 24 hours from the Fraser River to the west side of San Juan Island or whatever it was. And so playing that hunch, I was a teenager at the time, but it was like, I got up super early regardless. I went out to Limekiln. It was a beautiful morning with the calm sunset and, sunrise, and just hoped. And sure enough, J-Pod came up the west side early that morning. It was a beautiful, glassy blue seas. At that point, it was, J1 and J2 in the lead, followed by J8, and then the J19s with new little J41 in tow. And just, she was probably the youngest killer whale I've ever seen. Still had the fetal folds and everything. And the combination of seeing her at such a young age and just the beauty of the scene with the perfect viewing conditions, the perfect lighting, that's just one of those classic southern resident pass-bys on the west side that always stands out in my mind.
Yeah. I think we all have that moment where we've seen the youngest killer whale we've ever seen before. And I know for me at least, that moment sticks in my mind. And Jeff, I think you had a similar, not like that, but you saw J53 when she was not even discovered yet, right?
That's right. That was off of on one of our tours off of Snug Harbor back in 2015.
In October.
It was, and it was funny because we had a passenger on board who was there for the day from Salt Lake City and came out to see J-Pod, and we hadn't seen them in 2 or 3 weeks, and we were like, this is not the right time of year to be coming out here to see J-Pod, especially on a one-day trip. And we pulled out of the harbor, and J-Pod was sitting right outside of the harbor. And brand new J53.
Nice.
Who was your youngest whale, Sarah?
Probably J59.
Oh, yeah.
I'm having trouble remembering, but I think probably J59.
Well, you were the first one to see J59, so that one's going to stick in your memory.
Yeah, I think, because it had to be within a week, right? That's kind of what we were looking at.
Yeah, it was within 4 or 5 days of birth, yeah.
There might have been a T that I've seen that was younger, but J59 is one of the most that sticks out for me. L123 as well, down in Puget Sound, viewing from shore. Not ideal conditions, but we had L's and K's down there in the fall in 2015, and we knew that L91 had a calf already, L122. And I do remember standing there and it was like windy and crazy. And I had just made the run to Vashon to try to get them at Point Robinson.
Oh, yes, I know that run.
And then they turned around right before they got to the point. So I ran back to the ferry, like got on the ferry and tried to catch them from, West Seattle and did it. And I was standing on the beach and I remember I was standing with a couple of friends and I was like, I think there's a second calf in there. And it was cool. Like I went through my photos and very obviously had L122 and then a different calf in the group. And that was really cool too. But it took 4 or 5 weeks before center verified. So I had to sit on the news for like 5 weeks, but it was great.
So we'd love to hear other people's favorite encounters and youngest whales. So you can always get in touch with us. We're on Instagram at After the Breach. You can email us at afterthebreachpodcast@gmail.com and get to our website at afterthebreachpodcast.com.
Yeah, and we'll link all of these cool things we've talked about over our episode today. Monika, I know you have a beautiful photo of J19 and J41 from that encounter you mentioned. Do you mind sharing that with us?
I'd be happy to, yes.
Sweet. Put it on the...
You know the one from my description.
I know the one.
Yeah.
And I've got one of J53 from that day.
So we'll post those in the show notes. But yeah, definitely get in touch with us. We'll post on Instagram, and we'd love to hear your encounters as well. So definitely reach out to us. Our next episode will air May 27th. We're hoping that a friend of ours, Dave and Hafey, will join us for that, to be confirmed, but we'll have something great for you regardless. And thanks for joining us, guys, on After the Breach. Monika, thanks for being our first
thank you, Monika.
guest on the podcast.
Yeah, it was an honor. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And if you guys are enjoying listening to these, share them with your friends, follow us, leave us a review, get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you.
Yep. And we'll have Monika back again soon because we love chatting with Monika too.
Happy to be back.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.